Are you worried about bleeding yarns? This episode is going to cover what causes it, what you can do to avoid it, and what to do if it's already happened. Hey there, Fiber Junkies! Welcome back to the Color Cauldron. I'm Johanna, the owner and dyer behind Potion Yarns and host of this podcast. If you're a brand new viewer, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our weird, wacky, wonderful tribe called the Fiber Junkies, people who are obsessed with yarn and fiber and love talking about it, working with it, playing with it, and meeting other obsessed people as well. And if you're a returning Fiber Junkie, thank you so much for coming back, and I hope that you'll be really interested in today's topic. Today we are going to be talking about what to do when color releases off of your yarn and what causes that. So this is a really huge topic, and there's a couple things we need to go over first because I can't cover absolutely everything in this video, but I did want to talk to you guys about the science behind it and some kind of things you can do to avoid it and make sure that you're not doing anything to cause this problem. So the first thing we need to talk about is our terms. What is bleeding yarn? I often hear this a lot where people talk about yarn that has bled, and it's everybody's worst nightmare, right? You spend a lot of money on this fancy skein of yarn at your local yarn store or fiber festival. You come home, you spend hours, maybe even weeks or months knitting something really, really fabulous from it or crocheting something from it, and then you go to wash and block it, you put it in the water, and holy crap, all that color starts coming off, right? Or not all the color, but some color starts coming off. It's like everybody's worst nightmare. And the thing everybody wants to know is, if I see some color in the water, what if that runs the colors off of my sweater? Is it gonna fade? Is it gonna run into the other colors if there's multiple colors? Is it gonna get on my neck or my arms or my head or wherever it is touching if I wear it? It's scary stuff. So this is why I thought it was really important to talk about this. The first thing we want to talk about is our terms. Bleeding is when color transfers and the colors will muddy together. So this can happen when you have like a variegated skein, and let's say there's like a white section that's undyed, and then there's like a bright pink section and then a purple section, right? But it's all in one skein of yarn. The bleeding would occur if the pink and the purple are actually transferring onto the white and muddying or shifting that color, leaving splotches of pink and purple on the white yarn. This can also happen if you're doing color work, like the sweater that I'm wearing right now. I knit with a semi-solid kind of chartreusey neon green, and then I have a speckle that has a white background with black and gray speckles over it. And if any bleeding were to occur, I would probably see the green bleeding into the white background, or possibly even the black speckles sending some black to the green. Excuse me. Oh. So that is where the colors are actually shifting and being reabsorbed by other parts of the yarn. Now, what typically happens when a lot of people are talking about their yarn bleeding, a lot of times what they mean is they went to go wash it or block it, and in the rinse water, they see color coming off into the water. So the water might be tinted. Let's say you're washing a purple yarn, and the water might have like a lavender tint to it or even a pink tint to it. Oh my God, what is up with my sneezing? Holy crap, okay. That is something very different than bleeding. I like to think of that as just color releasing. So the color is lifting off of the strand or releasing off of the hair strand of the wool and getting into the water. But that's not actually bleeding, because most often in those scenarios, even if it comes off in the water, even if there's bright white yarn in your project, you're not going to have it shift onto the white yarn. It's just a little bit coming off in the rinse water, and that's perfectly normal. We'll go over a little bit more about that in just a minute. So I wanted to show you guys an example of bleeding and tell you that I 100% get it. I am not talking down to you guys like, oh, well, it's not our fault as indie dyers, right? I have been there. I have done it. I have had that heart-stopping, stomach drop to my toes, miserable moment of realizing that my sweater that I just put hours and hours of work into with multiple colors and a couple of very fancy, expensive skeins of indie dyed yarn just completely ran into my other fancy yarns, right? I've had that happen, and I wanted to show you one of my examples. I think this is actually the only time this has happened, which is pretty awesome if you think about it. I've been knitting like regularly and obsessively for about 12 years, and knitting a little off and on before that. And this is, I think I've only had one project ever in 12 years that has actually bled. So this is my Exploration Station, which is a Stephen West sweater. It's a fun, funky, avant-garde, asymmetric, cozy, weird sweater. And the idea is you use lots of scrappy yarns, leftovers, or single skeins from your stash to create this fun, funky striped color. And everybody's looks different because everybody's stripes theirs a little bit differently, does a different color sequence, etc. So this is mine I made a few years ago before I started dyeing yarn. And I had a fabulous skein of indie dyed yarn, and no, I'm not going to tell you who the dyer is because I really don't think it was her fault, and it doesn't really matter anyways, and it was years ago. But I had a beautiful skein of this neon kind of rainbow colored indie dyed yarn, and then I had a bunch of other, there's a couple other indie dyers in here, like down here, this speckle, and this is one of my early test skeins when I very first started dyeing. So like I went to go wash this sweater, and I'd washed and blocked many things before, and I'm going to tell you in a little bit all the things that I could have avoided when we go over what to avoid. I'll tell you all the things that I did or suspect that I did, because I kind of forgot some of the things that I'm pretty sure this was my fault. But I found that the bright neon pinks in this rainbow bled onto this neon yellow, highlighter yellow that is striped right above it. And that happened in the sleeves, and it happened in the body all the way around. Now, looking at it from a distance, you can't even see it. So my first thing is take a deep breath. It's going to be fine because you can't even see it. But when you get up close, you can actually see that the color has run a little bit. Thankfully, because of the style of this sweater, it's not a big deal. Having super crisp, clean lines is not really a big deal, and the colors almost look a little bit more blended, like they're supposed to go together. It worked out fine for me. It's really not a big deal. After, it looked a lot worse when it was wet than once it dried. But my rinse water was like very, very, very pink. It wasn't just a little tint to the water, it was very pink. So that was one reason why I knew that it was bleeding, and as soon as I realized that, I pulled it out as quickly as I could and tried to salvage what I could. But it was a little unsettling to see how it wasn't quite opaque, but almost. So that is what actual bleeding is. Now, when I rinsed this Zweig, which is the sweater I'm wearing right now, when I rinsed this sweater and blocked it, some of the green did tint the water a little bit, but none of it got off onto here, and it was like super sheer, like just barely tinted to the water. It wasn't actually very strong of a green, so I wasn't worried about it, and sure enough, absolutely none of the color transferred. It looks perfect after it's done. And so I just wanted to explain to you the difference between like a color release in the water and bleeding when it actually transfers and muddies your colors. Okay, so now that we know what we're talking about, let's actually discuss what happens. So let's go over what is bleeding or color releasing. Both of those, bleeding and color releasing, both happen from a lot of the same instances, but we're going to be talking about color releasing because bleeding is very, very rare. It does happen, but it is very rare. But we'll go over the science behind why this happens so that you can understand it a little bit better, and then that'll make sense when we go over what to do to avoid. So I wanted to have a really cool like whiteboard with all these multicolored markers to show you and be like a little teacher in a school, and I don't have anything like that. So rather than doing that, we're just going to use my handy dandy humble hand-drawn diagram on a piece of cardstock. So we're going to talk about the anatomy of hair. Now, I will tell you, if you don't already know this about me, when I'm not dyeing yarn, I am dyeing hair at a hair salon. I've been a professional licensed stylist for over 13 years, working behind the chair here in Kansas City. I still work part-time behind the chair, run my own business, and then I come home and run my own business with yarn. So yeah, I'm pretty busy. But the wonderful thing about this is being a hair colorist, specializing in color corrections and funky vivid colors like rainbow hair and things over the years, I have learned a lot about the science behind hair, and working with human hair has translated really well into working with animal hair, because everything we talk about today, it tends to go across the board with most dyed yarns, but it is specifically referring to protein fibers, which are animal fibers like wool and alpaca and those types of blends and fibers. So that's the kind of yarn that I sell, the kind of yarn I work with the most, and everything we're going to be talking about, especially when we go over things you can do to avoid it or what happens if it's already released into the water, what you can do then. All of those steps, action steps, are going to be related to wool and wool blends. So make sure that you read your fiber labels before you just try to go and treat it. So the cool thing is human hair and animal hair are very similar. Now they're not exactly the same, but they are very similar in their basic structure, which is all we really need to talk about today. So we're going to be talking about the hair shaft, which is what comes out of your head. It's what you put bobby pins in. It's what you can run your fingers through or brush out at the end of the day, right? It's the stuff that's coming out of your head. The thing that we all think of as hair. That's the hair shaft. The hair shaft is made up of 3 layers, generally. Some people only have 2, some animals only have 2, but in general it has 3 layers. The outer layer is the one represented by this fuchsia line up here, and that's called the cuticle. The cuticle is made up of overlapping scales that kind of lay over each other as they go down the hair strand. And when you damage the hair or ruffle it up, it goes against the hair strand and those scales will stand up, or they can be smoothed down. So like when your hair frizzes, those scales are standing up. That's what causes frizz. When you use like a nice shine serum and flat iron your hair, it's smoothing those all down, which is why you go from the top of your hair strand down to the bottom, because you want the hair to lay down, right? That's the cuticle, the outermost layer. It's the thinnest layer, and it's the one that we come into contact with the most when we're just styling and brushing our hair. Now the cortex is represented by these wavy green lines in the middle. The cortex is the biggest layer of the hair. It is the middle layer, and that is where you find all of the pigment molecules or the melanin from your hair. So if you're a natural blonde, your color is determined by the melanin that's in your cortex. When we go in to color your hair, like let's say you are a natural blonde and then you want to go to become an auburn, right? We would need to lift the cuticle and put color molecules into the cortex, because if you just put color molecules on top like I have here, that is like when you go to Sally's and you buy one of those color tinted shampoos and you put it on your hair and it makes your hair look kind of purple for like a couple days and then it washes right out, right? That is just coating your hair strand with color molecules. It's not going into the cortex. That's what we do when we have permanent hair color, or like what's called a demi-permanent, that you get professionally done in a salon. You can buy it in boxes and things, but that's the permanent hair color that will actually last for more than a couple shampoos, is going into the cortex. Okay? And I know I'm talking a lot about hair, but this is also referring to animal hair. So when we're dyeing yarn, we have to put, we don't just want to coat the top strand, because then every time you wash your yarn, it's going to fade and eventually it's going to come out, right? So we actually need to go into that middle layer to deposit those color molecules. Now the blue line in the middle is the medulla. The medulla is the innermost layer of hair, and sometimes you will find some melanin in there too. Some people and animals don't even have a medulla, and for our purposes today, we don't even need to go over that, but that is technically what is in the middle of your hair. We're going to be talking about the cuticle and the cortex today. So with dyeing yarn, we use heat and acid when we're working with protein fibers in order to lift that cuticle and push those dye molecules into the middle of the hair and make sure that they're in there deep enough that they're permanent and trapped there. Sometimes what can happen, especially if your dyer is a brand new dyer and they're a little bit more inexperienced, or it can happen even with very experienced dyers sometimes, especially when we're working with new colors or new fibers, or there's a lot of other environmental factors like humidity and air pressure and things that can affect this. But it is possible sometimes to put too much dye in. So it is possible that you might have filled up your cortex already with too many dye molecules, and those overlapping or those overrunning dye molecules have nowhere to go except sit on top of the hair strand. Think of it like a glass that you're going to fill up with water, and you go to pour that water in. There's only so much capacity the glass has, and eventually you're going to get to the top and you will hit capacity limit, and if you keep pouring, it's just going to start running over the sides. The same thing can happen with dye, only it's not as easy to see. So you don't get to a point where all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's it, can't put any more dye molecules in. Like, you can't always see that, and different dye molecules and different fibers and yarn weights and things like that will accept more or less. So it is possible sometimes for the dyer to get a little bit too much dye in there, and that will release a little bit more color. Now usually that comes off in the rinsing process. all indie dyers and all commercial companies are going to be rinsing and washing their yarns after they dye it, whether they're actually washing with any kind of like soap, or whether they are just rinsing with water, washing with water and rinsing. They go through several processes. I don't know anyone who just does one quick dunk afterwards and then calls it good. I'm not going to say there isn't someone, but I don't know anyone that does that. It's a pretty involved process usually, and every dyer and company has their different special techniques of exactly the way they like to treat their yarn right after it comes out of the dye pot to ensure that it's completely rinsed and it is ready to dry and go into a lovely professional looking skein to go in the mail to you, right? So everyone's a little bit different, but it follows the same basic concept, and it goes through multiple rinses, washes, etc. So the likelihood of too much dye still being on that strand when it gets to you is very minimal, but it can happen. It does not necessarily mean it is a mistake. It is possible that the dyer went through all the rinse processes and it came out clear, the water came out clear on their end, and then it still gets to you and releases some dye, and we'll go over that in just a minute. All right, so the other thing is some color molecules are going to be larger than other color molecules. So there are some colors that are notorious for this, such as deep blues, reds, neons, etc. Some of them have just much larger color molecules than other dyes, and so it will be harder to get them into that middle cortex. They'll fill up faster, and sometimes they will go into the cortex but not completely, so it's kind of like they're caught in between the cuticle and the cortex. That can also cause some color releasing. This can also cause color bleeding if the yarn isn't properly set and rinsed by the company that sells it, but again, that's very minimal. It does happen. I'm not going to say it never happens. All companies, even big machine run companies that are doing this by machine instead of by hand, they are even going to have mistakes because we're all human, and things can slip through the cracks. And indie dyers, of course, are also human, and I'm not going to say that there's never been a mistake by an indie dyer ever. It is entirely possible. But just keep in mind, we're all human, we all make mistakes, and the likelihood of that happening on a regular basis is very unlikely. The biggest factor, in my opinion, is, besides using like hot water, is the pH of your water. And this is something that is beyond your dyer's control. It is beyond your control to a large extent. Unless you have a pH testing kit and you're testing every time you run water to rinse or wash your hand knits, this isn't something that you're going to be able to really control. But your water must be at a neutral pH in order to guarantee 100% that there's no chance that the color is going to lift off. If your yarn has been properly rinsed, it's not going to lift off as long as it's at a neutral pH. Now that is something that most of us don't have a pH testing kit or the time to worry about or whatever, and it's not something I'm suggesting you go out and buy, but be aware that all water will vary based on where you are, what kind of water you have, etc. If you use well water, it's going to be different. I'm here in Kansas City, Missouri. If I rinse my yarns in my water, and at home all of my yarns that I've dyed are coming out perfectly clear and totally set properly, and everything looks great on my end, and I send it to you, and you're even in a different city, much less a different state, much less Japan or Australia or Ireland or all of these places that I've sent yarn before, I don't know what kind of water you have, and so there's no way that I can guarantee that your yarn won't release a little bit of color in the water because you probably have different water than I do. So it's quite likely that it's going to be different. You're also, if you're in a different part of the country or the world, you're going to have different weather conditions. That can actually affect it. You're going to have all of these different things that are going to change what happens with your yarn. So the water is one of the biggest factors, if not the biggest factor, and there really isn't anything that we can do about that except test your swatch and follow all of the instructions that we go over for avoiding getting color releasing. Okay, so now that we've talked about how dye molecules can just be too large or there can be too many of them, let's talk about what you can do to avoid it and what you can do if that happens. So one of the main culprits of color releasing is incorrect washing or blocking methods. Now I say this with love and gentleness. As we just saw, I've had my fair share of incorrect blocking and washing methods. So let me share with you some of the things that I did wrong that you can avoid, okay? What you want to make sure that you do with all yarn, and I want to stress this so hard, this is not an indie dyer problem. This is a yarn that has been dyed synthetically problem, okay? If you're not using undyed, naturally colored wool, then it is likely at some point in your life that you will experience some of this, even if it's extremely minor. Most of you, if you've been knitting for any length of time, more than like a year, say, or whatever, have probably experienced this already. Or if you haven't, it's quite likely that if you keep knitting or crocheting that you will. Now, that's not said to scare you. That's just meant to explain that it's just a problem that happens. This happens with commercial companies all the time. It happens with big indie dyers. I don't want to name drop here, but there are a couple of very well-known indie dyers that have made it beyond the cottage industry stage into a large company, all found in yarn stores all over the world, 500, 600, 1,000 yarn stores all over the world, whatever, that this can still happen with their yarn. There is one particular big name company that's been around for a very long time and has excellent quality yarns, by the way, that is notorious for having very saturated yarns and using a lot of layers of color, like I do in my yarns, that their yarns have been known to release color into the wash frequently. And a lot of people get on social media and complain about it. I see it in yarn groups all the time, and they are saying, oh, my yarn's bleeding. And the first thing I always want to say is, are you sure it's bleeding, or is it just releasing in the water a little bit? Because those are different. But even if it is bleeding, like, unfortunately, yeah, sometimes that does happen, but there are things you can do to avoid it. So the first thing with any yarn, indie dyed, commercially dyed, whatever color it is, but especially if it's red, blue, or neon, any color, anytime, you want to make sure that you are always, always, always washing and blocking in cold water. Not lukewarm, for sure not hot. Absolutely never, ever, ever hot water, right? It needs to be in cold water. The reason for that is that the hot water can cause the dyes to release more than cold water will. It can open up. So here's an interesting fact for you. With hair and with yarn, heat opens the cuticle, okay? So that's why you can blow your hair out with a blow dryer and a round brush, and you can take your curly hair and you can round brush it out and straighten the hair shaft, because you're using heat to open that cuticle and reform that hair. Same thing with yarn. If you use hot water, it can open that cuticle, even just slightly crack it open a little bit, and color can come out. So you want to avoid heat at all costs, whether you're putting it in the washing machine or hand washing. Also, all indie dyed yarn, it's always good to try to stick to hand washing. You can sometimes machine wash them if they're super wash, and especially if they have some nylon or something in them. I have machine washed some of my bases, like my Foxy sock that has superwash merino and nylon in it, and had great results. But you must always, always, always test a swatch before you do that, and make sure that you don't put anything in with it that you don't care about if it gets ruined when you're testing your swatch, because you don't want to get dye on your other clothes, and you don't want to ruin your pair of socks or your beautiful sweater or whatever. So always test your swatch. Always test your swatch. Always test your swatch. Always test your swatch. I can't say that enough. Always, always, always test your washing instructions on a swatch. Now, I'm not the best about that. I do sometimes skip that, but then when this happens, guess what? I didn't test a swatch of this yarn. So guess what? When that happened, it was my fault because I didn't test a swatch. I would have avoided that had I known that. Also, like I said, don't use hot water. Don't use agitation. Don't get in there and just really, really scrub it. And be careful when you put it in the washing machine. Put it on the delicate cycle only if you're going to do that. But we're going to stick to hand washing today because that's really the best route to go to ensure this doesn't happen. Don't put a lot of agitation in there. You just need to kind of gently swirl it around. If it's really, really dirty, spot treat the parts that are really, really dirty and try to avoid a lot of friction and excessive rubbing and agitation. The other thing, and this one is one of the biggest, so I think I used warm water when I did this, right? I don't think it was hot, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't cold. I think it was warm. So that was my first mistake. I didn't use agitation on it, but my next mistake, and the one I'm pretty sure was the biggest culprit of this, besides not washing my swatch, was I let it soak. I let it soak for a long time. You don't need to let your yarn soak, unless it's like filthy dirty. If you've been like rolling around in the mud pits, which who hand knits a sweater and then goes out and rolls in the mud pits, right? probably not something you're going to be doing. But if you do that, then you might need to let it soak a little bit longer, but even then you got to be careful how long you let it sit. But for most average wearing around the house to work, running errands, etc., you're not going to need to aggressively soak or scrub your hand knit sweaters or socks or whatever, right? Usually what you can do is just swirl it around for a couple of minutes and then pull it out and it's good to go. If you feel like it's just kind of stinky, like maybe you're at the bonfire and it smells like smoke, or maybe you got some BO on there and it really stinks and you really need to get it out, right? You can let it soak, but I would say don't let it go beyond 20 minutes. Check it after 20 and probably try to pull it out. Usually after 20 minutes, that's more than enough time. In fact, I usually only let mine that I am like, ooh, this is a little smoky, I need to get that odor out. I will make sure that I'm checking it after 10 minutes. And usually 10 minutes is plenty, sometimes 15 at the longest for me. I usually don't go over 15 minutes. But that's a very rare occasion. The huge majority of the time, like when I blocked my Zweig, I put it in there, I swirled it around, left it maybe 2-3 minutes, pulled it out, good to go. I just washed some hand knit socks in a really nice merino cashmere nylon the other day, hand washed them. And, I'd been wearing them in shoes and they were, they'd been sweating, they were a little gross. I popped them in, swirled it around with some wool wash, let it sit for about 5 minutes, pulled them out, line dry them, perfect, soft, perfect, bouncy, look fabulous. You don't need to let them sit a long time. Soaking is one of the biggest reasons that you'll get color releasing into the water. Just the longer that it sits, it has time to let those dyes release and come off of the hair strand. So don't soak, it's not necessary, and it could cause some bleeding or some color releasing in your water. All right, so the next thing that I have to go over is kind of a personal preference, and it's tricky because it doesn't always happen across the board. But you want to, if you are really, really worried, or if you wash your swatch and you're noticing some releasing or some bleeding, you want to avoid using scented soaps or detergents in your washing. I try to avoid using regular laundry detergent. I used to use a really nice laundry detergent that was made locally here, and it's good for delicate items. It is better than using regular laundry detergent for sure, so if I'm out of wool wash or something softer in a pinch, I will use some of it. But I found that, like on this sweater, I did use a scented laundry detergent for delicate items, but it was scented. And after doing some research, I found that a lot of the scents that are in laundry detergents and soaps that we use to wash our clothes can actually cause those, if there are any molecules sitting on top of the hair strand, it can cause those to release much quicker and sometimes even slightly lift the cuticle. So you want to be really, really careful the ingredients that you're using and what scents you're using. I usually tell people to avoid it, just go with unscented wool wash. They're made specifically for wool. They won't damage your yarns. They don't require a rinse, which is my absolute favorite part of it, because you can just pop it in with the wool wash, swish it around, pull it right out, and go to dry it immediately. You don't have to do an extra rinse, whereas if you use a laundry detergent or any other type of soap, you have to put in a rinse cycle as well, and you've got to make sure that your water temperatures are the same or very close to the same, because if you shock it with a difference between hot and cold water, then that can cause color releasing, and it can cause felting if you're using a non-superwash wool. So you have to be really, really careful. So I try to use unscented wool wash. Now some people find that even wool wash is a little bit too strong for them if they have super sensitive skin or something, so you have to use your discretion there. But for the most part, unscented wool washes are the way to go. They do have scented versions. For my personal hand knits, I really like to use the scented version, like the eucalyptus smelling eucalyptus is one of my favorites, or lavender is my absolute favorite. But it is something that people with allergies will have a problem with, so if you're gifting this, maybe use the unscented. And if you're worried about color releasing, or the first time you go to block it or wash your swatch, you might want to try it with an unscented wool wash, just to make sure that you don't have any of that transference of color. Now, some of the wool washes that I like are Eucalan, Soak, I think there's one called Unicorn, Kookaburra is a really good one. There's a bunch of them. You can find them on Amazon or at local yarn stores. A lot of indie dyers are actually Soak or Eucalan distributors, like wholesale distributors, so you can purchase them on their websites. I don't sell them, but a lot of people I know in this industry do sell soak on their website as well. That's a really great way to take care of your hand knits, and I highly, highly recommend it. If you don't have access to that right now, or you just ran out or something, make sure that you use the gentlest laundry detergent that you have, preferably unscented. Almost all laundry soaps, even the cheap ones at Target, have an unscented version for people that have allergies or scent sensitivities. Try to go for the unscented. Another thing that you can use that is really good for delicate items is baby shampoo. It does require an extra rinse like laundry detergent, and it's not ideal. It's not as good as a wool wash in my opinion, but it is really good for delicate items, and it tends to be, because it's made for baby sensitive skin, a lot of times you can get unscented versions as well, and you can have the reassurance of knowing that it's going to be extra gentle on your yarn. And I haven't had any issues with it having color releasing in the water, but I've only tried it like once. So let me know if you've tried baby shampoo on your hand knits, how that went for you in the comments below. All right, so those are some of the things you can do to make sure that you're avoiding it and you don't have a sad story like I do. Thankfully, my sad story turned out to not be that sad. I freaked out in the moment, but like I said, after it dried, it was less noticeable, and then I looked at it from even like 6 inches away. I can't even really tell. I have to like get up close to see it. But I wear that sweater all the time, and people never, ever notice. And I've even told a couple people, and they're like, I can't even see it. So that's my other next tip. So what happens when you've washed your swatch and some color releases into the water and it makes you nervous and you want to avoid that? Or let's say it's even bleeding onto your yarn a little bit on your swatch, and you definitely want to avoid that. The first thing to do is take a deep breath. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. I promise you it's gonna be okay. It's just yarn. And I know that sounds ridiculous because yarn is my life and my business, right? I get it. We're fiber junkies. We're obsessed with yarn. Yarn is life. Absolutely it is. But at the end of the day, nobody is going to die because your yarn gets messed up. First of all, your yarn probably isn't going to get messed up. We're going to go over what you can do. But secondly of all, worst case scenario, it bleeds even worse than my sweater and it ruins your project. Is it going to be awful? Yes. Are you going to cry? Probably. Are you going to drink a whole bottle of whiskey? Quite possibly. That's okay. But nobody died. Nobody is paralyzed. World peace didn't come to an end. You didn't start World War III. You didn't drop an atomic bomb. You're going to be fine. All right? Everyone is fine. Breathe. Okay, now that we've stopped freaking out, maybe crying a little bit still, but we stopped freaking out, let's talk about what we can do. So let's say you wash your swatch, there's some color coming off in the water, and you're like, oh gosh, I just don't even want to take the chance that it could bleed. What do I do? So you can take, even if this is a finished project, not just your swatch, you can take a little bit of Dawn dish soap and just a little bit of rubbing alcohol. You just need a little bit, like a splash of rubbing alcohol and a little pinch of Dawn dish soap in your rinse water when you go to rinse your project instead of soap. Okay, so get new water, a little bit of Dawn dish soap, a little splash of rubbing alcohol. Put your project in there and swirl it around. Don't let it soak for more than 10 minutes. Probably you just need to swirl. In fact, I wouldn't let it soak. I would just let it swirl, see how we do. Now the reason you want to do this is the surfactants in the Dawn dish soap are going to help to like pull any color that's sitting on top of the strand off. The rubbing alcohol will also help to loosen any of those sticky dye molecules that maybe are stubbornly sticking to the cuticle or like halfway in the cortex but not totally, that could come off in the rinse water. And I wouldn't recommend washing your hand knits with rubbing alcohol. I just want to put that out there. This is like a fixing an issue, not a, oh, I think you should put rubbing alcohol in all of your in all of your wash water. Don't do that. It's actually kind of harsh on your yarn. It'll be okay if you just use a tiny little bit and you don't let it soak and you're just being very gentle with it just to get those sticky dye molecules off, but you don't want to do it on a regular basis. However, that can pull those little bits off and ensure that you're not going to get bleeding in your project. Then after you do that, you absolutely have to rinse it. You cannot just pull it out and go straight to dye or to the drying process. You've got to rinse it, and then you've got to make sure that you are really, really gentle when you roll it in a towel and lay it flat to dry and everything. Okay, so that can help to relieve that. If you are extra scared, or if you wash your swatch and you get a lot, like your water is close to opaque, a lot of dye is coming off, then you're gonna have to put your skein of yarn, if you've only washed your swatch and you have your yarn left, you're gonna have to put your yarn in a pan and you're going to have to reset it. So the way that you do this with acid dyes and wool or wool blends, make sure you read your fiber content. With acid dyes and wool or wool blends, you are going to put your yarn into a pan. I recommend going to the dollar store or the grocery store and buying those aluminum baking pans that are disposable. You know, the ones that you get to take to a potluck or something, so that if you don't get your dish back, it's okay. Get one of those, because you don't want to do this in pans that you're going to be eating your food out of. That's really important. Don't put it in tonight's dinner pan, please. Put it in your disposable pan or an old pan that you're not going to use anymore for cooking. Put your yarn in there, put some warm water in, not hot, but like lukewarm water in there, and then put a tablespoon of white vinegar, just the kind that you use for cooking or that you have around your house. You can find it super cheap at the grocery store. Put some white vinegar in there, about a tablespoon for your hank of yarn. Put it in the oven. I like to cover mine with foil and put it in the oven. Turn the oven on to 200 degrees or less, 180 to 200. Do not go above 200. You could boil your yarn and ruin it. Even with superwash yarns, it might not felt, but you could ruin it, make it limp and gross. I have done it before, actually. One of the very first skeins of yarn I did in the oven, and I did not know that rule, and I put it in at 300, and my yarn is not totally ruined. I was able to knit a pair of socks, but they're like limp, and they like fall down really easily, and they're just like really sad. Don't do it. It'll ruin your yarn. So 200 at the most, 180 to 200. Let it sit for 20 minutes. Don't let it sit longer. Don't walk away and leave it for 2 hours. Let it sit 20 minutes. Turn the oven off. Leave it in the oven. Or you can pull out with hot pads, sit it on top. Don't take your yarn out. Let it cool to room temperature before you take your yarn out. And then you can put it in your rinse water, rinse it like you normally would, etc. Like we talked about before. Don't use hot water. Just use a little bit of unscented wool wash or no wash, just use water, and swirl it around, pull it out, make sure that the color isn't coming off. If it's just a little tint again, you'll be fine. If it's still coming off a lot, repeat the process that we just went over, okay? If you do all of that, you should be able to avoid any bleeding yarns. Now, that last step about resetting your yarn, you shouldn't ever have to do, probably. It is only a last resort if your swatch is bleeding excessively and you are very, very worried about it, like if you're doing color work or stripes or something and you don't want to have any transference of color or something like that, or if you're just extra hyper freaked out about it, whatever. But it shouldn't come out. If it's just a light little tint, it shouldn't ever come off and actually transfer onto your yarn. It shouldn't be a problem. It's going to be okay. I can't tell you how many times I've had yarn that had a little bit of tint in the water, multiple colors going on, and the whites were still perfectly white and bright and came out just fine. It's going to be fine. Okay, but always test your swatch. If you're doing color work or stripes, always make sure that you include all of the colors that you're using in your swatch as much as possible so that you can make sure that there's no color transference. I hope that helped relieve your mind a little bit, give you some solid science, help you to understand a little bit. We're also going to do a video next time about dry crocking, which is when the color is coming off on your hands as you knit or crochet with it. If that's your issue, stay tuned, and next week we will have a video about that. That's where we're going to cast off. Love you.